Coffee Afternoon. We're delighted to have you here. As usual, please make sure that if you're not speaking, please make sure that your microphone has been muted, just to avoid any interference with today's speakers. I'm delighted today to be joined by three speakers who will be representing a range of different organizations talking about redeployment and health and safety. Up first today is Danielle, who will be talking about how volunteer development managers across all 5 branches of Imperial War Museums have welcomed back volunteers after lockdown, and we'll be including specific examples from IWM North. Hello, welcome Danielle.
Hi everybody, I'm going to turn my screen off now because I'm kind of teetering on the iPad, so you can all hear me okay? Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll turn this off and get on with things. Hi everyone, I'm Danielle. I am the Volunteer Development Manager for Imperial War Museum North, and I'm really just going to talk about how we welcomed our volunteers back after lockdown. So I'm sure what we're doing is nothing new to everyone, but I'll just tell you how we got on and what we did. So basically, IWM opened its doors on the 1st of August, and we welcomed all our volunteers back to do their front of house roles, visitor customer service type roles, and we did that across all 5 of our branches. And just whilst we were in lockdown, all of the volunteer programme managers were actively working behind the scenes, keeping all of our volunteers engaged and up to date as to what's happening throughout the lockdown procedure. So we did lots of newsletters and communications whilst we're all in lockdown. Will, if you want to just flip over to the next slide, that'd be great. So as we neared our return to coming back to the museums, we basically drip-fed information as to how things were changing within all of our organisations across each of the sites. And on the screen you can see that we did lots of visual storytelling. So we showed images of how things have changed with the posters, the test and trace, the social distancing markers and the sanitising stations, and also the perspex that we put up in the retail team to keep them safe. We also did lots of surveying. We asked people how they felt about coming back, who was shielding, who really wanted to come. We just did a lot of like gauging of opinions and felt, got some feedback from the individuals themselves. But throughout the lockdown, we did do the weekly updates in the newsletters. We got really good at Zoom meetings, and I'm sure most people did during this lockdown time. So we had some really engaged volunteers. For those that did do the digital side of things, we also did lots of calling around and making sure people were still engaged that way. And what we found from speaking to all of our volunteers over this period was that actually they wanted to know how things are changing, but they wanted to come on site just before the public entered the building and see how things are changing. So we invited them in. If you want to flick over to the next page, we also sent pictures of the PPE that we would be providing. That's me sporting the old mask and visor combination. Obviously we wouldn't expect them both to be worn at the same time, but that was what we were providing. And then if you move on to the next slide, Will, we did a familiarisation day, and basically we asked people to come into the museum before it opened. We provided a tour of the museum and the office spaces to highlight the new safety measures. That all volunteers were given a returning to IWM policy to read and sign, which really went through some of the very, the detail about keeping everyone safe, including volunteers, suppliers and partners. It was about returning to the physical workplace and providing practical guidance so that risk can be properly managed and aligned with all of the IWM wider return to normal business objectives. And our head of departments created a welcome back video, which wasn't just for volunteers, it was for the whole of the organisation. It was 27 minutes long, but it actually provided all of the safety detail that you needed to know to provide that reassurance for staff and volunteers coming back on site. And I'll go back into more detail about that in a little while. And we also reiterated the point that there's no real pressure to return to volunteering until they felt comfortable, and the onus was on the volunteers themselves to risk assess it for their own personal circumstances and choose whether it was the right time or not to come back to volunteering. Will, do you want to flick over to the next screen? Thank you. So this is the basis of the film. It basically talks about how to keep yourself safe, keeping your colleagues safe, and keeping visitors safe. Just flick to the next screen for me, Will. So these are just some of the areas that we covered, and it's common sense. It's the stuff that we all have been talking and hearing in the news. But follow the if you get into work, how you get into work or how you get into the museum. Make sure when you're in the stations you follow the one-way system, and you're frequently reminded about social distancing. Listen to the PA announcements about social distancing. Always wear and take your face mask and sanitizer, and just avoid touching things. And this is the things that we've all been told for ages, really. So travelling to work, that was about keeping you safe. Next screen, Will. Also, we have implemented these pink signage in and around the museums. So we said look out for the pink signs, mats and vinyl floors, stickers reminding people to stay safe. If there's queues and wayfinding, there may be barriers outside to support with visitor queues and distancing, directional arrows indicating routes and one-way systems around the museum, and familiarise yourself. So insert a front of house roles. Your manager may arrange a site orientation date, which is what this was when they came in to watch the film before your shift. Next slide, please. We also, had to think about tea and coffee and the things that, volunteers really need when they're on site, refreshments. So, bring your own mug, keep everything, take it home with you, wash it, that kind of thing. Locker storages were limited. Organise yourself from a bag, essentially. And we had a safe room. We put in a mess room. We created this bigger space so that no one was congregating in the office areas. We provided seating that was spaced apart, and generally just told them about some of the do's and don'ts when on site. Next slide, please, Will. So what we did have to talk about was this keeping you safe and making sure that, all volunteers wore the standard, the IWM issue face coverings, and when in public areas they should wear them at all times. If you can't wear face masks, we provided visors as well. Next slide, please. Well, so a lot of stuff about keeping your colleagues safe, so be considerate to others. The office working environment, clearly a lot of people were still working from home, but we had on every door to every office a clear sign that indicated the numbers of workstations available for use at any one time. And also workstations were clearly, cleaned before and after use. For many of our volunteers, they didn't have any workstations, so there was real no need, but they knew of the safety and the cleaning procedures that were in place in the office areas. Next slide, please. Well, next slide. Oh, thank you. Again, in the shop, we highlighted the new screens. Everything was contactless. There was no cash. It was a cashless retail area. Hand sanitizer is clearly available in every single room, in every area that volunteers are around, and for the public spaces. Obviously, staff were trained to help with any crowds building up and how to manage the distance and ask people to stand back should things get too crowded. And obviously in the shop, we were telling people not to touch things unless they really wanted to buy stuff. And there's lots of visible cleaning going on in and around the public areas. Next slide, please. Well, Yeah, so visitors, keeping the visitors safe, it was all about this cleanliness again. So the touch screens, they had stickers on saying please don't touch, and if they did have the opportunity to interact with an interactive, then they were encouraged to use hand sanitizer. Audio guides again were thoroughly cleaned, and again there's crews in the museum visibly cleaning handrails and doing lots of cleaning within the times that people are visiting, just so that they can see they're reassured. Next slide. So feedback so far, I was quite surprised at the number of the volunteers that did want to come back. On average, we have about 4 volunteers a day in the museum. A quarter haven't returned, and that's because of maybe they're shielding, they're older, they're more vulnerable, they just don't feel safe at the moment. I'll just go back one. I've been informed by the London gang that only 50% have returned, and that's because we've only allowed for front of house roles to return. And I think the major barriers for a lot of people are the public transport. So if you are getting on a bus or a tram and it's crowded, it's really off-putting. And obviously in Manchester, there's a local lockdown. The rates were getting really out of control. So a lot of fear about getting out and about. People felt they should be staying at home and reducing the virus. And again, I think for local lockdown, that we've got a low visitor number in response to that. So volunteers sometimes when they're on gallery, they're not as it's not as busy as it used to be, so they find themselves with not much interaction. So sometimes coming in for shifts and going a little bit earlier, or if it gets really bad local lockdown, then they're kind of just staying away until things get better. But that in a nutshell is what we've done in terms of welcoming our volunteers back. They've all been very supportive. We did surveys just before returning, and we're doing surveys now to see how people feel. So we're constantly gaining feedback from the volunteers as to how they feel. But a lot of people have returned, and a lot of people, I must say, were so isolated and so fed up of being at home on their own, that coming back to the museum is that social interaction that it really does help with their well-being. So we do have a lot of volunteers that are like, I'm just going to chance it, I'm going to come back and I'm going to get involved. And that's where we're up to at the moment. And it's only been a couple of months, so we're just building up some more feedback in another survey. So I haven't got much more to give you on that. Has anyone got any questions? Is there any in the chat?
And as usual, if you do want to ask a question, either come in now, or you can ask in the chat. With redeployment of volunteers, Danielle, have you found the changing government guidance has confused people, including volunteers and staff, or has it been generally quite coherent in terms of the communication and what's been expected?
Yeah, it's all been very confusing. I just think people just listen to what they want to listen to and come in and risk assess it for themselves. So we haven't stopped anyone from coming in because local guidance is restricting people from going to other houses, but to places of work. Volunteering hasn't been mentioned that much, so has it really? So no, I'm not really going into too much detail on that.
Okay, and have you looked into, as you mentioned, the front of house volunteering came back first. Are you in the processes of planning non-front of house roles to return anytime soon?
Well, I basically at North, IWM North, it is just front of house. There's hardly any back of house stuff. I do know there has been some communication in London and Duxford about back of house, but I think that's still being risk assessed and considered, so I'm not quite sure, and I'd have to ask my colleagues in London and Duxford.
I can actually jump in there, Danielle. Sorry, hello.
Oh, thanks, Gemma.
Gemma, I'm the head of volunteering and engagement for IWM, so I oversee all 5 sites. At the moment, because we are still open as sites, it's particularly focused on our front of house volunteers, because obviously they are essential for us to remain open. Whereas our message to members of staff who perhaps aren't involved in front of house working is very much still to stay at home. So that's kind of mirrored in the volunteer roles that support them. Where possible, we've tried to create new roles through this. So we have created some remote volunteering opportunities. We've got some digital programs that we're working on at the moment, and we've been actively encouraging lots of our volunteers to kind of switch into those roles to try and keep them engaged, but obviously that's not involving them coming physically onto site. But yeah, at the moment we're kind of mirroring what the government are saying, that only essential people, so those that are essential for us to be open to the public, are on site, and that's mirrored with our volunteers as well.
That's great. Thank you for answering the question. That's really interesting to hear, and we'd definitely love to hear in future, once the front of house, the remote roles have been established, to hear how those have gone along, see some examples of the successes of remote volunteering.